Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. This is a big one today.
It really is. I mean, human societies are constantly locked in this endless, basically exhausting debate about whether our behavior is shaped more by biology or by culture. Nature versus nurture.
Right, the classic argument. Everyone has an opinion on it.
Exactly. But what if that debate itself, just the way we frame it, completely misses the deeper system at work?
And that is the paradigm shift we're exploring in this deep dive. Because when you look at the world through a strictly binary lens, either it's all genetics or it's all societal conditioning, you're dealing with a literal crisis in perception.
Yeah.
You end up interpreting incredibly complex human behavior through this single, flat, explanatory layer. And the reality is just far more dynamic than that.
So think about this for a second. Have you ever had a moment where the opposite sex suddenly seemed like, I don't know, an entirely alien species? Just completely mind-bogglingly different from you.
I think we all have at some point.
Right. And there's this great anecdote from the source material we're looking at today that perfectly sets the stage for this. So the author describes being raised in a very progressive, university-based, liberal elite family. Picture the kind of environment where every human being, regardless of gender, was treated as exactly alike. For Christmas, she'd get a Barbie doll and a baseball glove, or an enamel baking stove and a set of steel-tipped darts.
Okay, that's a pretty intense mix.
It was. The messaging she received growing up was just clear and consistent. There are no innate gender differences, only different societal opportunities.
Which is a very common and honestly well-intentioned cultural framework. It forms the foundation of a lot of modern progressive thought around gender and child rearing. The underlying idea is that if you just remove the environmental bias, the biological differences will basically vanish.
Right, but then she becomes a parent, specifically the parent of two boys. And around the time her older son turns 2.5, he enters his dinosaur phase.
As they do.
As they do. Most kids go through this. But he doesn't just like dinosaurs. He becomes instantly, intensely obsessed with blood-swilling, carnivorous dinosaurs. The plant eaters. Total wimps in his eyes. He refused to even wear a T-shirt if it had a picture of a stegosaurus on it, purely because it just ate leaves.
That is amazing.
Right. So the author looks down at this toddler who is literally snarling around her feet, trying to gnaw off her leg, and she has this epiphany that conflicts entirely with her upbringing. She realizes, this goes deeper than culture.
It's a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. Because you provide a strictly gender-neutral environment, and yet these strongly dimorphic behaviors seem to just emerge anyway. So does a love of carnage, even innocent toddler carnage, begin in the cultural ether, or does it begin in genetics?
Yeah, and more importantly, how do those two forces actually interact? Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are unpacking the insights from Deborah Blum's book, Sex on the Brain: Biological Differences Between the Sexes.
She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist, and her work here is just a meticulous examination of the biological and social systems that shape the differences between men and women.
So, to set the analytical stage clearly right from the start, we are not treating sex differences as purely cultural today.
Right.
Nor are we treating them as purely biological. The mission today is to investigate how evolutionary pressures, hormones, and social environments form this incredibly complex, dynamic feedback loop.
A loop that continuously reshapes human behavior.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting at the absolute foundation, the design level. If we're going to talk about differences between the sexes, we have to ask the biggest, broadest structural question imaginable. Why do you even exist as part of a two-sex system in the first place?
It's a great question.
Because if you think about it purely from a biological efficiency standpoint, having two sexes is incredibly cumbersome. Why aren't we all just self-replicating hermaphroditic beings?
It's a profound structural puzzle. And in the source material, there's this hypothetical scenario proposed by biologist David Cruz that illustrates this perfectly. He asks us to imagine a world of self-replicating hermaphroditic chickens.
Okay, I love this thought experiment.
It's great. So picture a farmer with a flock of traditional two-sex chickens, and then another farmer with a flock of imaginary, all-female, self-fertilizing chickens.
Well, in the traditional two-sex flock, only half the population, the hens, can actually lay eggs. The males can't produce offspring directly. They consume food, they take up space, but in terms of direct bodily reproductive output, their contribution is zero.
Exactly. The mere existence of males automatically cuts the reproductive output of the population in half right out of the gate, Crews actually calculated that in just 7 years, assuming no chickens die, the farmer with the self-sufficient females would own over 633,000 egg-laying hens. Yeah. And the competitor, relying on the traditional two-sex system, they'd only have about 56,000. So the self-replicating system is vastly, exponentially more efficient at producing sheer numbers.
And beyond just the numbers game, the actual act of mating in the wild is incredibly dangerous for any animal.
Highly dangerous.
It requires a massive relaxation of vigilance. When wild animals are mating, their senses are not tuned to the heavy paws of a predator creeping through the bushes. Mating is basically a flirtation with death. You can even see this in how fast primates try to get it over with. Common chimps take about 7 seconds. Gorillas take maybe a minute.
Right. It's a vulnerable state. And it highlights the immense biological cost of a two-sex system. It's inefficient, it's physically dangerous, and it exposes the organism to sexually transmitted diseases. I mean, we could have spared ourselves syphilis, chlamydia, countless other pathogens if we had simply evolved to clone ourselves.
So again, why do we have two sexes?
Earth-based biology overwhelmingly favors a two-sex system because of one massive advantage: genetic variability.
Think about what happens when you have an agricultural monoculture, where every plant is genetically identical. One specific fungus or disease can wipe out the entire global crop in a matter of years because none of the plants have any natural resistance.
Genetic variability acts as the ultimate shield against that. It creates a constantly moving target for diseases and parasites. If a population is essentially a massive army of clones, a single lethal mutation, or a perfectly adapted pathogen, can eradicate the entire species overnight.
Yeah, sexual reproduction shuffles the genetic deck with every single generation.
Biologists point out that self-replication is incredibly rare in complex organisms because, over long evolutionary timescales, it dooms the species. The two-sex system, with all its inefficiencies and risks, was conserved by evolution for billions of years because it is the most robust survival strategy against a hostile, constantly changing microscopic environment.
So we have this two-sex system as a fundamental, inescapable fact of life on Earth. But within that system, there is a massive structural inequality when it comes to human reproduction. Which brings us to what evolutionary psychologists call the minimum investment theory.
What's fascinating here is how the biological requirements for passing on genes differ so drastically between males and females, and how that biological asymmetry has shaped behavioral tendencies over millions of years. Let's look at the absolute minimum physiological requirement to produce a child.
For a male, stripped down to the absolute bare biological minimum, the investment requires healthy sperm and a brief period of interest in sex.
That's it.
That is the minimum biological threshold for a male to successfully pass his genetic material to the next generation. But for a female, the minimum investment is staggering by a comparison.
A human female must produce an egg, which is metabolically expensive. If fertilized, she must gestate the fetus for 9 months. She's literally building a new organ, the placenta, and sharing her own bodily resources, calcium and calories. She faces the severe physical risks of pregnancy and childbirth.
Right.
And after birth, historically, she must provide nutrition through lactation and handle an immense amount of childcare for years just to ensure that single genetic investment reaches an age where it can survive on its own.
And she doesn't even have to be actively seeking reproduction to become pregnant. The biological burden falls almost entirely on her physiological shoulders by default.
This extreme asymmetry in reproductive investment is a hallmark of mammalian biology. To understand how this shapes behavior, evolutionary psychologists often look at other species to see the baseline patterns at their most extreme. Take elephant seals, for example.
The elephant seals offer a brutally clear picture of this dynamic.
They do. Elephant seals are highly polygamous. Because the male's minimum investment is just sperm, his evolutionary success is dictated entirely by how many females he can successfully mate with. This creates a hyper-competitive, incredibly violent environment among males.
Yeah, the males grow to be massive, sometimes 3 to 4 times larger than females, and they fight each other in bloody, brutal, sometimes fatal battles for dominance of a stretch of beach and exclusive mating access to a harem of females.
A huge percentage of male elephant seals will live their entire lives and die without ever passing on their genes, simply because they couldn't win those physical fights.
But for the female elephant seal, her evolutionary success isn't about fighting for multiple mates. It's about protecting the huge energetic investment she has already made in her pup. Her evolutionary strategy is geared toward nurturing, endurance, and survival, not hyper-aggressive territorial competition.
We are vastly more complex than elephant seals, obviously. But the underlying evolutionary logic, that the different physiological demands of being a sperm producer versus an egg maker naturally influence tendencies toward competition, risk-taking, and survival strategies, is deeply woven into the mammalian biology we inherited.
It's a structural reality of our evolutionary past. If you belong to the sex that has to fight intensely for limited mating opportunities, your biology might reward risk-taking, physical size, and aggression. If you belong to the sex that invests massively in a small number of offspring, your biology might reward caution, physical endurance, and deep emotional bonding.
Exactly.
But of course, humans are not highly polygamous elephant seals. We have shifted significantly toward monogamy and shared parenting.
We have, and this brings a completely different set of biological pressures into play. In a largely monogamous species, the sheer survival of the offspring often requires the intense, prolonged participation of both parents. Human babies are born incredibly helpless compared to, say, a foal that can walk hours after birth. They require immense resources for over a decade.
So, if we are going to define ourselves as a monogamous species, we have to look at the biological implications of fatherhood. I want to walk you through some incredible studies out of Israel that the author highlights, looking exactly at the role of parental involvement, specifically focusing on fathers and how their interaction changes the developmental trajectory of a child.
Researchers in Israel observed fathers interacting with their babies over a long period. They categorized them broadly into indifferent fathers versus highly involved fathers. The studies showed that fathers who spent significant engaged time with their 9-month-old babies actually perceived their children completely differently than indifferent fathers did.
They didn't just spend more time in the same room. The interaction actually altered the father's perception of the child's cognitive potential.
The involved fathers literally perceived their 9-month-olds as smarter and more capable. And because they saw the child as capable of complex interaction, they engaged with them more deeply. They would sit with them in the evening, reading board books, talking to them in complete sentences, anticipating their reactions.
And the indifferent fathers.
Fathers who spent almost no time with their infants tended to view the babies as basically unformed, like a passive organism too dim to grasp the concept of a book or an emotional interaction.
And this creates a compounding developmental effect over time.
A massive one. A follow-up study looking at those same children when they were 3 years old found that the children of the highly involved fathers performed noticeably better in preschool across various metrics than the children of the bored or indifferent fathers. Furthermore, the involved fathers expressed much more pride and personal pleasure in their children's achievements.
So ask yourself, how does this biological reality that human children thrive demonstrably better with the heavy emotional and cognitive investment of a second parent conflict with some of the strict traditionalist cultural models you might have grown up seeing? For a long time, many modern cultures promoted a model of the indifferent father, the distant breadwinner who leaves the actual intellectual and emotional child rearing entirely to the mother. If our specific biology is best suited for a true, engaged partnership in raising a highly complex, helpless child, then that cultural model is actually working against our evolutionary design.
That is the dynamic tension at the heart of this system. Biology sets a baseline requirement. Helpless human infants need massive, multi-person investment to reach optimal cognitive development. Culture creates a structure around that requirement. When the cultural structure doesn't match the biological need, you see measurable deficits in the real-world outcomes for the children.
We've looked at the broad evolutionary design level. We understand why there are two sexes and the different historic pressures on them. But how does this actually play out inside your body? What are the actual biological levers being pulled to influence your behavior?
We're moving into the mechanisms: hormones, brains, and the incredible concept of neuroplasticity.
When you talk about behavior in biology, hormones are usually the first suspects brought in for questioning. But you have to be very careful not to view them as simple puppet strings that dictate your every move.
Deborah Blum uses a great analogy here. She says you shouldn't think of hormones as puppet strings, but rather as cast members in the incredibly complex play of your behavior.
I love that.
They're on stage, they are influencing the scene, they are interacting with the other actors, but they're not the only ones on stage, and they are definitely not writing the entire script by themselves.
That's a crucial distinction. Let's look at the two most famous cast members in this biological play: testosterone and oxytocin. Testosterone is typically associated with the male biological profile, though females produce it as well in smaller amounts. It's a hormone that spikes in times of physical or social challenge. It's deeply associated with fast responses, competition, physical exertion, and aggression.
And on the other hand, you have oxytocin, which is heavily present in females, though men certainly have it as well. Oxytocin is the hormone fundamentally required to support lactation, but its behavioral effects extend far beyond that. It is associated with deep bonding, nurturing, trust, and social attachment.
You have these complex chemical messengers flowing through your bloodstream, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and subtly nudging your brain toward different behavioral responses. But if you think hormones are simple, straightforward directors of male and female behavior, the reality of neuroscience is about to complicate that picture significantly.
Very significant.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to explain this research by Mark Breedlove at the University of California, Berkeley. He studies the brains of rats, specifically looking at the literal physical mechanism of how a brain becomes masculinized in a newborn male rat.
Most people would assume, quite logically, based on what we just discussed, that testosterone floods the male rat's brain, flips a bunch of genetic switches, and wires the brain to be male. But biology is rarely that straightforward.
To understand this, you need to know about an enzyme in the brain called aromatase. Think of aromatase as a biological currency exchange booth. What aromatase does is it takes testosterone molecules, processes them, and literally converts them into estradiol.
And estradiol is a potent form of estrogen.
Estrogen, the hormone we traditionally label in textbooks as the female hormone.
Breedlove's research uncovered a mind-bending reality regarding this process. In newborn male rats, a specific region of the brain called the hypothalamus is packed tightly with aromatase and estradiol receptors. It turns out that the actual physical masculinization of the newborn rat brain is driven by estrogen.
Let that sink in for a second. The brain of a male rat becomes functionally male because it relies on a female hormone to build its neural pathways.
To prove this mechanism, Breedlove looked at male rats with a specific naturally occurring genetic mutation called testicular feminization mutation, or TFM. This mutation prevents the rat cells from recognizing androgens. Androgens are the umbrella category of hormones that includes testosterone. In these mutant rats, the testosterone is floating around in their system, but the cells are entirely blind to it. It's like having a radio signal broadcasting, but the antenna is completely broken.
If testosterone is the sole defining director of male savior, these TFM rats should not develop any male behaviors whatsoever because they can't process the signal.
But they did. These male rats with TFM never developed typical male physical anatomy on the outside. They lacked functional male genitalia, for example. But behaviorally, when they reached adulthood, they acted exactly as if they were fully equipped males. They approached females and engaged in the exact sequence of typical male mating behaviors.
How is it physically possible for them to act like males if their bodies are completely blind to testosterone?
Because they simply bypassed the testosterone to estrogen conversion process in their brains. They utilized straight estradiol, which is naturally produced in small amounts by their adrenal glands, to carry out the masculinization of their brain circuitry. The developing brain grabbed whatever estrogen was available in the bloodstream and used it to build a male neural pathway.
It completely shatters the rigid cultural categories we place on these chemicals. We say testosterone is male and estrogen is female, but the brain itself doesn't care about those labels.
As Breedlove points out, natural selection and evolutionary processes show absolutely zero concern for the cultural gendered labels we assign to chemicals millions of years later. Evolution is ruthless and pragmatic. It can serve whatever chemical pathways work efficiently. If converting testosterone to estrogen is the most efficient metabolic way to wire a male rat's brain in utero, that is exactly the tool evolution will use, completely indifferent to our modern definitions.
So the chemical bath your brain develops in is incredibly complex and defies simple categorization. But what about the physical structure and processing methods of the brain itself? Do the brains of men and women actually process everyday information differently?
They do. And this is where we see some fascinating functional differences in the lab, particularly in complex cognitive tasks like spatial navigation.
Imagine you are placed in a virtual reality computer maze. This is exactly what researchers did with male and female college students. The maze they built was programmed with two distinct types of navigational cues. First, there is the raw geometry of the maze, the exact distances of the long corridors, the sharp 90-degree angles of the turns. Second, there are landmarks placed throughout the maze, distinctive visual markers, like a unique painting on a wall or a specific piece of furniture.
When they tracked how the subjects solved the maze, They found a very clear division in the cognitive strategies utilized by the sexes. Men overwhelmingly navigated using the geometry. They were mentally calculating distances and tracking the angles of their turns in three-dimensional space.
Okay.
Women, on the other hand, navigated primarily using the visual landmarks.
To prove this wasn't just a coincidence, the researchers started actively messing with the environment. When they changed the geometric shape of the maze, lengthening corridors and changing angles, but left the paintings and furniture exactly where they were, the men became completely disoriented and lost, while the women navigated through it just fine. Yeah. But when they left the geometry perfectly intact and moved or removed the visual landmarks, the women were suddenly thrown off and the men kept going without a single problem.
It perfectly mirrors the real-world scenario of asking for driving directions. One person says, head north for 1.2 miles, then turn 90 degrees west. The other person says, drive past the old gas station and turn left at the big red barn. It shows different cognitive strategies being engaged to solve the exact same spatial problem. But you have to contrast this spatial study with another major neuroimaging study conducted by Stephen Peterson at Washington University, which looked at language processing.
Right, this is the cake goes with study. Peterson utilized fMRI machines. For context, an fMRI machine tracks brain activity by measuring the flow of oxygenated blood. When a specific part of your brain is working hard, it requires more oxygen, and the machine lights up that area on a screen. Peterson put male and female subjects in the machine and gave them a rapid-fire word association task. He would say a word like cake, and the subject had to immediately say a related word out loud, like frosting or birthday.
Now, given the stark differences we just saw in their maze navigation study, you might reasonably expect to see massive structural differences here too. Historically, earlier, cruder brain science often suggested that women use both hemispheres of their brain for language, while men strictly used one.
But Peterson's fMRI data found absolutely no significant structural differences in how men and women process the language task. Both sexes activated the exact same precise regions of the prefrontal cortex to generate the associated words. The only minor functional difference was that the men's blood flow into that specific region was slightly faster, and their actual vocal response was a split-second slower. But structurally, the cognitive processing map was identical.
This raises an important question regarding how we interpret scientific data. Peterson himself warns against falling into the seductive trap of biological determinism.
Yeah.
When you see a functional difference, like in the maze study, the immediate temptation is to declare men are biologically hardwired by evolution to understand pure geometry, and women are hardwired to look for visual landmarks.
But Peterson asks us to consider the profound impact of the cultural layer you were raised in.
Does that functional difference in navigating a virtual maze represent innate, inescapable biology? Or does it simply reflect how our culture teaches boys and girls to interact with space from a very young age? If you socialize young boys to play extensively with building blocks, video games, and spatial structures, and you socialize young girls with different types of play, their physical brains will literally adapt to prioritize those learned strategies. The human brain is incredibly plastic. The specific ways you use it during childhood literally physically shape its functional pathways into adulthood.
You cannot easily untangle the biological hardware from the cultural software running on it. The mechanism is a constant shifting blend of both. But what happens when these internal mechanisms, these hormones and brain pathways, are subjected to intense, unavoidable environmental pressures out in the real world? Let's move into how these biological levers react under extreme conditions, looking at environmental pressures, risk, and real-world outcomes.
We have been talking about relatively subtle differences in virtual maze navigation and word association games. But there is one specific behavioral arena where the gap between men and women is so massive, so statistically stark, and so consistent across different global cultures that almost all behavioral endocrinologists agree it is rooted deeply in biological architecture.
We're talking about aggression.
Yes, the aggression gap. It is the most persistent behavioral difference between the sexes.
Let's dive into the hard crime statistics, because the numbers are staggering and require careful analysis. If you look at the crime of robbery across populations, robbers are committed by men at a ratio of 10 to 15 to 1 over women. Men are 10 to 15 times more likely to commit a robbery. Now, if you look at simple assault, the ratio narrows significantly to about 3 to 1. Still a massive gap, but much closer than robbery.
That distinction between the types of crime is analytically important. Simple assault is frequently a crime of sudden emotional rage, a momentary loss of impulse control. Robbery, however, often requires premeditation, calculated intimidation, and the active threat of severe physical violence to secure resources.
A pure sociologist looking at these numbers might argue, well, men are generally physically larger and possess more upper body strength than women. So they utilize violence more simply because they know they have a practical physical advantage in a confrontation. It is just a rational calculation based on size, not an innate biological drive toward aggression.
It's a very common and logically sound sociological argument. To test whether physical size was the sole determining factor, researchers looked at the ultimate equalizer in human conflict: firearms. The underlying theory was that if physical size and strength are the only reasons men commit more violent intimidation, then the invention and widespread availability of guns should completely equalize the behavioral playing field. A gun makes physical size and muscle mass completely irrelevant in a confrontation.
But the data completely destroys that sociological theory. Guns do not equalize the behavior at all.
They don't. When women do commit robberies, which, remember, is already a statistically rare event compared to men, they only choose to utilize a firearm about 30% of the time. Male robbers, on the other hand, utilize guns 50% of the time. Even when holding the ultimate equalizer, the behavioral choices diverge.
The statistics become even more stark when you analyze domestic partner murders.
In cases of domestic homicide committed by men against their partners, close to 75% of the men utilize a gun. When women kill their domestic partners, despite the obvious physical disadvantage they usually face against a male partner, they only use a gun about 50% of the time. Furthermore, the statistics regarding who actually initiates the fatal physical conflict are incredibly telling regarding the threshold for violence.
These are grim statistics, but they are vital for understanding the reality of the behavioral gap. In cases where a woman ultimately kills a man in a domestic situation, the data shows that the man actually initiated the physical fight 51.8% of the time.
Now look at the inverse scenario. When a man kills a woman, the woman was the one who initiated the physical altercation only 12.5% of the time.
The researchers in the source material point to these massive, systemic, unyielding disparities and conclude that societal conditioning alone cannot fully account for them. The baseline threshold for lethal violence, the inclination toward extreme physical intimidation, appears to have a strong underlying biological component deeply linked to the male evolutionary strategy we discussed earlier with the elephant seals.
It connects directly back to that baseline of evolutionary reproductive investment. Historically, across mammalian species, males had to engage in high-risk, high-stakes physical competition to secure reproductive success. Evolution seemingly selected for a neural architecture in males that possesses a lower threshold for initiating physical aggression and a much higher tolerance for life-threatening risk.
Speaking of life-threatening risk, the source material offers one of the most chilling historical case studies of how male and female biology and behavior diverge under the ultimate extreme environmental pressure, the Donner Party.
It is a profound and tragic historical event that serves as a grim laboratory for human survival behavior.
For context, the Donner Party was a group of American pioneers migrating to California in a wagon train in 1846. Through a series of delays and decisions, they became trapped by massive early snowstorms in the high elevations of the Sierra Nevada mountains. They were forced to endure a horrific, months-long winter of absolute starvation and freezing temperatures, famously resorting to cannibalism to survive.
A physical anthropologist named Donald Grayson decided to rigorously analyze the survival statistics of the Donner Party to see if there was a measurable gender disparity under these conditions of absolute, brutal starvation and physiological stress.
The survival statistics he uncovered are amazing. There were 87 pioneers trapped in the mountains. By the end of the devastating winter, 40 men had died and 28 women had died. If you break that down by percentages of the population, the men suffered a massive 25% death rate. The women suffered only an 8.5% death rate. It's roughly a 3-to-1 survival ratio, heavily favoring the women.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Grayson's analysis reveals two fascinating biological and behavioral layers to this survival gap. The first layer is purely physiological. Women naturally carry a higher percentage of subcutaneous body fat, and their internal metabolisms process prolonged starvation differently than men do. Under extreme cold and severe caloric deficit, the female physiological system is biologically better adapted to endure, conserve energy, and protect core organ function.
But the second layer of Grayson's analysis is entirely behavioral, and this brings us right back to the concept of risk-taking.
Why was the Donner Party trapped in the high mountains so late in the season in the first place?
Because they made a collective decision to take a shortcut.
The men leading the wagon train made a deliberate, calculated decision to leave the established, well-known, and relatively safe pioneer trail. They chose to gamble on an untested, largely unmapped route called the Hastings Cutoff, hoping it would save them significant time on their journey to California.
Historical journals and evidence suggest they made this massive gamble over the explicit, vocal objections of the women in the party.
An occupational medicine professor named Stephen McCurdy analyzed the sociology of this specific decision. His conclusion was that the decision to take that fatal shortcut was driven almost entirely by the male leadership. He noted that it is incredibly difficult to imagine the women who are intensely focused on the immediate safety and day-to-day survival of their children, willingly voting to take a massive, untested geographical risk with the lives of their families just to potentially save a few weeks on the trail. The men were biologically and socially more inclined to gamble for a high reward. The women were inclined toward caution, risk mitigation, and preservation.
We see echoes of this biological inclination toward risk every day in modern mundane life. The source material quotes Jay Belsky, a professor of human development, who uses a perfect, everyday analogy that you have probably seen: fathers tossing babies in the air.
It is a ubiquitous scene in parks and living rooms everywhere. A dad is playing with a baby or a toddler, tossing them up in the air and catching them. Belsky points out that the dad will usually keep tossing the child higher and higher, pushing the absolute limit of the physical thrill, until the mother eventually intervenes from across the room and says, "Okay, that's enough, stop," before someone gets hurt.
Belsky notes that if you look at emergency room statistics for minor pediatric injuries, you would likely see more children injured on dad's watch than on mom's, simply because men possess a biological baseline that is more willing to flirt with physical risk, even when it involves their own children. It is the exact same underlying instinct that chose the untested Donner Party shortcut in 1846, playing out on a much smaller scale in a modern living room.
It represents a spectrum of risk tolerance. The specific environment changes from an untested wagon trail to throwing a toddler a little too high, but the underlying biological tendency toward pushing the boundaries of risk seems to persist across eras.
We have looked at aggression, survival physiology, and risk tolerance under extreme pressure. But how do these biological tendencies shape our normal social networks and how we communicate with each other on a daily basis? To understand adult social structures, researchers often look at childhood play, observing kids before the heavy layers of adult cultural expectations have fully settled in.
The source material references a classic 1972 sociological study by Janet Lever, who spent countless hours systematically observing playground dynamics among elementary school children. She found stark, undeniable differences in how young boys and girls organically organize their social worlds when left to their own devices.
Think back to your own time on a playground. Lever found that the boys overwhelmingly preferred competitive games with clear, unambiguous winners and losers games like basketball or capture the flag. Furthermore, she noted that they spent a massive amount of their total playtime actively arguing over the rules. They would completely stop the game, have a heated, extended argument about whether a ball was out of bounds or a tag was fair, and then they would resolve it and immediately resume playing. But notably, Lever almost never saw a boys' game actually end prematurely because of a dispute.
They thrived on the structural confrontation, they possessed mechanisms to resolve it, and they kept playing.
Now, contrast that with the girls' playground dynamics she observed. The girls tended to gravitate toward games that required ongoing negotiation, turn-taking, and shared roles, like playing house or doctor. They would spend significant time democratically deciding who gets to be the doctor, who gets to be the nurse, who gets to be the patient. It was highly collaborative.
But when a serious quarrel broke out among the girls during these games, the outcome was entirely different. Lever found that girls had a much lower tolerance for direct, unresolved confrontation. If a serious argument started about fairness or roles, the girls would frequently just end the game entirely. Someone would walk away, feelings would be deeply hurt, and they might stop speaking to each other for the rest of the day. The social rupture was much more devastating to the activity.
This is where we have to ask the critical evolutionary question. Is this just purely cultural conditioning at work? Do we explicitly teach boys to be tough and brush off arguments, while teaching girls to be emotionally fragile and sensitive?
Many sociologists would argue exactly that. But evolutionary biologists point out a fascinating parallel. You can observe incredibly similar social dynamics in our closest primate relatives, the chimpanzees.
Among chimpanzees in the wild, the males are constantly vying for status in a rigid dominance hierarchy. They have vicious, sometimes bloody physical fights over status and resources. But once the fight is definitively over, The male chimps are famous among primatologists for their rapid reconciliations. They will physically approach each other, groom each other, and essentially let the disagreement go almost immediately to maintain the cohesion of the male coalition.
Female chimpanzees, however, exhibit a much stronger, longer-lasting emotional response to conflict within their social circles. They hold grudges longer. They do not reconcile as quickly after a dispute. So when we observe human boys intensely arguing over a playground game and moving on, and human girls abandoning a game entirely because of hurt feelings, we have to consider that these patterns of emotional resilience and conflict resolution might have biological roots far deeper than a 1970s schoolyard.
Speaking of deep evolutionary roots and how we process emotion, there's another study detailed in the book that is absolutely fascinating. It's about how men and women read facial expressions, conducted by researchers Ruben and Raquel Gurr.
This touches on the absolute core of human empathy, social intelligence, and historical survival. The Gurrs designed an experiment to test exactly how accurately men and women could read different emotions on human faces displayed on a screen.
When it came to reading expressions of happiness, both sexes were equally adept. But when it came to reading expressions of sadness, a massive, statistically significant gap opened up. Women were 90% accurate at detecting sadness in a face, regardless of whether they were looking at a picture of a man or a woman. They could pick up the absolute subtlest micro-expressions of distress.
But the men's results were vastly different. Men were 90% accurate when reading sadness on another man's face. But when a man looked at a woman's face, his accuracy plummeted to 70%.
The researchers noted that a woman's face had to be dramatically, overtly, undeniably sad for a man to reliably notice it. The subtle, nuanced expressions of female distress completely bypassed their perception.
Why would that specific blind spot exist? Why would men be highly attuned to male faces, but largely blind to female sadness? And why would women be hyper-attuned to everyone's sadness across the board?
This is where the evolutionary theory becomes genuinely chilling when you think about our ancestral past.
If we look back at ancestral hominid societies, anthropologists believe they were likely structured somewhat similarly to chimpanzee troops. You have a dominance hierarchy maintained by larger, stronger males who are prone to sudden, violent outbursts to maintain their status. In that environment, male-to-male violence is a constant lethal threat. Therefore, a male needs to be highly, acutely attuned to the facial expressions and emotional shifts of other males. He needs to know instantly if the alpha male is getting angry or feels threatened.
But what about the females living in that ancestral environment?
For a physically smaller female living in close proximity to potentially dangerous, volatile males, being able to accurately read the emotional weather of those males is not just a polite social skill. It is a literal daily survival requirement.
If a dominant male is starting to feel frustrated, sad, or agitated, that negative emotion might quickly pivot into violent, displaced anger. If the female can accurately read the absolute subtlest beginnings of that emotional shift, she has the critical time necessary to accommodate, placate, or physically escape the situation before violence occurs.
The evolutionary theory suggests that women evolved a hypersensitive capacity for empathy, specifically the ability to instantly read distress and negative emotions in others as a vital defensive adaptation against the power differential in an ancestral, dangerous male scenario.
It is a dark origin story for human empathy, but it provides a biological framework for why women today might be statistically much better at reading the emotional temperature of a room than men are. It's a biological legacy of survival. But it doesn't have to be entirely dark. Let's look at another primate cousin that took a very different evolutionary path regarding social systems, the bonobos.
The bonobos offer a fascinating counter-narrative. They are often colloquially called the make-love, not war apes. Genetically, they are just as close to humans as common chimpanzees are, but their entire social structure and method of communication is radically different.
Bonobos are famous for being spectacularly exuberantly promiscuous. They weave sexual contact into literally every single aspect of their daily lives.
They utilize sexual contact not just for reproduction, but as a primary tool for conflict resolution, for greeting each other after a separation, for expressing gratitude, and for cementing friendships. If two bonobos find a sudden cache of high-value food, their excitement doesn't lead to a violent, competitive fight over the resources like it would with chimpanzees. Instead, it leads to a spontaneous group sexual encounter to completely diffuse attention, and then they share the food peacefully.
It is a completely open, constantly receptive, low-conflict sexual culture. So the obvious question anthropologists ask is, if we are so closely genetically related to bonobos, why doesn't human society look like bonobo society? Why is human culture, globally across almost all societies, characterized by immense sexual repression, complex rules, and strict moral codes regarding who can sleep with who?
Uh, That is one of the great enduring mysteries of evolutionary anthropology. Why did our specific hominid line diverge so sharply from the peaceful bonobo model? One prominent theory is rooted purely in pathology and disease. As early hominids began interacting in larger, more complex social networks and trading between tribes, unrestricted sexual intercourse with multiple partners would have created a catastrophic vector for sexually transmitted diseases.
So human sexual repression might have started not as a moral imperative, but as a primitive, unconscious public health measure. The tribes that accidentally developed cultural rules restricting sex survived the plagues, and the tribes acting like bonobos died out from disease.
That is one distinct, highly plausible possibility. But there is another theory, one that relates back to the dynamics of power and what evolutionary biologists call the sexual arms race.
This is the idea that males and females are not always playing cooperatively on the same team when it comes to reproduction.
Precisely. Remember the minimum investment theory we discussed earlier? A male biologically benefits from spreading his genetic material as widely as possible. A female needs to fiercely protect her massive energetic investment and carefully choose the absolute best genetic partner. This inherently creates deeply conflicting evolutionary agendas. Some biologists argue that human sexual morality, the strict rules and cultural repression we see globally, are the direct byproduct of a biological arms race. Males sought to use cultural rules to control female reproduction and guarantee paternity, and females sought to use culture to secure male resources and protection for their offspring.
The culture we see around us today might just be the fossilized remains of millions of years of male and female biology actively trying to outmaneuver each other. Which brings us perfectly to the core of this entire discussion, the feedback loop, how culture and biology reshape each other.
This is the absolute core of the crisis in perception we mentioned at the start. People desperately want a simple answer. They want to say biology is destiny, or they want to say culture creates everything. But human beings are not static, pre-programmed biological machines. We are highly adaptive systems.
And the key word to understand this system is feedback. The environment doesn't just act on us passively. We act on our environment, and then that changed environment reaches back inside us and physically changes our biology.
This raises an important question. What happens when our modern cultural systems, which increasingly and rightly promote gender equality, shared roles, and non-traditional career paths, collide head-on with a biological system forged over millions of years of asymmetrical survival pressures?
The source material highlights an upcoming massive long-term study by sociologist Alan Booth that seeks to answer exactly this question by looking at internal chemistry.
Booth is looking at hormones over time, specifically focusing on cortisol, the primary stress hormone, and testosterone. He wants to track families over a long period to observe what happens biologically when parents consistently and deliberately push their daughters toward traditionally male-dominated occupations. Highly competitive, high-stakes, aggressive environments like corporate law or finance.
The traditional, rigid biological view would say, well, the girls do not possess the natural baseline testosterone for that aggressively competitive environment, so they will be chronically overstressed, their cortisol levels will spike to unhealthy levels, and they will ultimately burn out or fail.
But the feedback loop theory suggests something entirely different and far more dynamic. Booth is investigating whether the behavior itself will actually alter the biology. If a young woman is constantly placed in competitive, aggressive environments, will her baseline testosterone levels gradually rise over time to meet the chemical challenge? Will her brain pathways literally physically rewire themselves to reduce the cortisol stress responses in those specific situations?
We already know from extensive animal studies that if you artificially change a monkey's status in a social hierarchy, its internal hormone levels change accordingly. If you take a submissive monkey and engineer a situation where it becomes the alpha, it receives a massive, sustained testosterone boost. The behavior and the social environment cause the hormone change, not just the other way around.
Hormones undoubtedly influence behavior, but environment and behavior reshape the hormones and the neural pathways. It's a continuous reciprocal dance between the inside and the outside.
But this evolutionary dance is not always peaceful or cooperative. We mentioned the sexual arms race earlier. I want to explain a fascinating and somewhat terrifying study by William Rice on fruit flies, which illustrates this perfectly.
Royce's experiment is legendary because it perfectly illustrates how the sexes act as intense evolutionary pressures on each other. He essentially forced a population of fruit flies to evolve under strict, highly controlled laboratory conditions. Because fruit flies breed so rapidly, he could watch hundreds of generations of evolution occur in real time, specifically observing how males and females interacted when forced to compete.
And what he witnessed was literal microscopic chemical warfare.
Yes. In this controlled environment, the male fruit flies rapidly evolved seminal fluid that actually contained potent toxins. These toxins were specifically designed to kill off the sperm of any rival males that might already be inside the female, ruthlessly ensuring the male's own genetic success.
But there was a massive collateral cost. The toxins were physically harmful, sometimes lethal, to the female fly herself.
They were. The male's evolutionary strategy for success actively damaged the female. So, in rapid response, the female fruit flies evolved complex biochemical defenses to neutralize the male's toxins just so they could survive the mating process. The sexes were evolving substantially and violently in direct response to the threat posed by the other sex. They adopted directly opposing biological strategies for genetic survival. Reproduction was not a cooperative event, it was a battle.
Now, obviously, humans are not fruit flies poisoning each other during reproduction, but Rice's study demonstrates a profound, inescapable evolutionary principle. Males and females are a fundamental part of each other's environment. We adapt to each other, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes defensively.
And in humans, that intense adaptation persists. But we are currently dealing with a massive temporal mismatch. Our underlying biological structures, our hormonal baselines, the emotional processing centers in our brains evolved over millions of years of harsh ancestral conditions. But our cultural expectations and social environments now change rapidly in a matter of decades.
Think about it. 100 years ago, women in many Western countries could not vote. Today, they are running multinational corporations and leading nations. Culturally, a century is a blink of an eye. Biologically, it is zero time at all.
This severe temporal mismatch creates immense systemic tension. We are attempting to run modern, egalitarian cultural software on ancient, dimorphic biological hardware. The feedback loop is currently grinding its gears as the rapidly shifting culture tries to pull the slow-moving biology in an entirely new direction.
Which forces us to confront the elephant in the room regarding this entire topic. If men and women possess equal cognitive potential, if the biological differences are just subtle hormonal tides and minor structural variations, why do men still hold the vast, overwhelming majority of political and economic power in global society?
That is the ultimate, inescapable question of gender biology. And it is a historically dangerous question, because depending on how society chooses to answer it, you can wander into very dark, oppressive territory.
When analyzing this, you have to understand the historical trauma associated with biological determinism. Historically, whenever an institution has claimed that biology is destiny, or that science objectively explains why a certain demographic group possesses less power, it has reliably led to atrocities.
The source material details the horrific history of the eugenics movement to illustrate this danger, specifically focusing on the tragic story of Carrie Buck.
Carrie Buck was a poor working-class woman from Virginia in the 1920s. She was officially deemed by the state government to be feeble-minded and genetically inferior based on the flawed biological science of the era. The state actively sought to legally sterilize her against her will to prevent her from passing on her supposedly defective genes to the next generation.
The legal battle over her bodily autonomy went all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1927. And the Supreme Court, comprised entirely of elite, highly educated men, ruled in favor of the state's right to sterilize her. Just as Oliver Wendell Holmes famously wrote in the devastating decision, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Carrie Buck was forcibly legally sterilized, based entirely on the weaponization of biological science by those in power.
Science has historically been used as an incredibly effective weapon by those holding power to subjugate and control those without it. Men in power used biological arguments to legally mutilate a poor woman. This historical reality explains why so many people are deeply, understandably terrified of letting biological science define gender differences today. The trauma of eugenics and biological determinism is real and relatively recent.
It is a valid fear, rooted in historical fact. However, the author argues that ignoring the reality of biology entirely out of a fear of how it might be misused leaves us blind to the reality of who we actually are as a species. Refusing to acknowledge that males and females possess different biological predispositions doesn't ultimately protect us. It just means we are fighting societal inequality with one hand tied behind our backs, actively ignoring half of the complex equation that drives human behavior.
So, how do you understand the current power imbalance without falling into the trap of biological determinism? The author introduces a fascinating concept from evolutionary biologist Bobby Lowe, the modern novel environment.
Bobby Lowe points out that for the very first time in the entire history of life on Earth, human beings are living in a completely novel, unprecedented ecology. For millions of years, evolutionary success was defined simply and brutally by sheer numbers of offspring. The more kids you successfully raised to reproductive age, the more successful your genes were.
But in modern industrialized culture, that ancient biological rule is fundamentally breaking down.
Completely breaking down. Today, evolutionary and social success in our culture is not about having 15 children. It is about massive, intense, prolonged investment in one or two children to ensure they thrive in a highly complex society. And in this modern niche, what is the most vital resource for ensuring the success of those children?
It is definitely not physical strength or territorial aggression anymore, it is education.
Yes, education and complex social navigation are the new currency of survival. In a modern information economy, physical size and aggressive dominance, the traditional male biological advantages forged on the plains of Africa are becoming increasingly irrelevant to actual survival, wealth accumulation, and success.
We are actively creating a new evolutionary niche where shared intellectual partnerships, deep cognitive capability, and female corporate mobility actually serve our underlying reproductive and survival interests vastly better than the old patriarchal models based on physical dominance.
We are witnessing a real-time environmental and evolutionary adjustment. Because education and financial resources are the new currency of survival, it is in everyone's biological best interest for women to wield equal economic and political power. The environment has profoundly shifted, and the entrenched power dynamics are slowly, painfully being forced to adapt to that new reality.
I love the quote from Emory University researcher Kim Wallen in the book, which perfectly sums up this tension between our biology and our potential. He says, the boundaries between genders are naturally quite blurred. There are very few things that only males or only females can do. That, however, is not the same as saying there are few things that only males or only females are likely to do.
It is a brilliant, vital distinction. Biology dictates statistical likelihoods across massive populations. It does not dictate individual capability or destiny. Nature can and does regularly produce women who are larger, stronger, and more aggressive than average men, and men who are far gentler, more empathetic, and more nurturing than average women.
The biology provides a loose predisposition, a subtle chemical nudge, but the environment and your own choices decide exactly how that predisposition gets expressed in the real world.
Precisely. The system is entirely malleable.
So what does this all mean for you?
It means that the crisis in perception we discussed at the beginning is a constant trap. Whenever an observer, whether it's a politician drafting policy, a sociologist analyzing data, or a parent raising a child, tries to interpret complex human behavior through a single explanatory layer, they are getting it fundamentally wrong.
If you choose to treat sex differences as purely biological, you are ignoring the profound, literal, brain-altering impact of our social environment. You are ignoring neuroplasticity and the powerful feedback loop that shapes who we become.
And conversely, if you choose to treat gender as entirely a cultural construct, a blank slate waiting to be written on, you are completely ignoring millions of years of rigorous evolutionary design that shaped our hormonal baselines, our brain structures, and our fundamental survival strategies.
The deeper reality is the dynamic feedback loop. Biology provides the constraints, the initial push. Culture provides the context, the playground, and they are continuously dancing with one another, reshaping each other with every single generation.
Which leaves us standing at a fascinating precipice regarding the future of our species.
We have spent this whole deep dive talking about how our behavior actively changes our biology. Alan Booth's study on cortisol and competitiveness, brain plasticity. We are a unique species because we are fully capable of understanding our own biological pre-programming and, through conscious will, choosing to transcend it. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. If human culture acts as the ultimate environmental pressure, could our modern pursuit of gender equality actually be guiding our evolutionary future? If we continue to intentionally build a society that rewards shared partnership over violent competition, could we, over the next few thousand years, be consciously breeding an entirely new human biology? Are we actively designing an evolutionary future that leaves the violent, sexually dimorphic apes we once were far behind? It is a staggering amount of power to hold in our collective hands.
It is the ultimate expression of the feedback loop. We are not just subjects of evolution. We are becoming the architects of our own biological destiny.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. Understanding the interaction between biology and culture helps clarify why debates about sex differences persist and why simple explanations always fail to capture the complexity of human behavior. This project is completely free and publicly accessible. If you value this kind of in-depth, nuanced research, please consider becoming a supporter on our Patreon to help fund the time and tools behind the show. Also, be sure to check out the shorter, visual overview of today's topic via the mini explainer linked in the description below. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment below with the books, articles, or deep topics you'd like us to explore next. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.